Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Biden-Harris Progress Report number 8, which has the title Unfinished Business, Taking Care of Unfinished Business. And we are going to spend the next 60 minutes, actually 40 minutes presenting. We're going to ask you to hold us accountable for using those 40 minutes well. And then we're going to have plenty of time also to discuss, which could include a little bit of venting, a little bit of assessing where we are, and also hopefully a little bit of enthusiasm for what we can accomplish in 2022 if we put our noses or whatever to the grindstone. All right, I want to reiterate an opening question, a yes or no question for the chat box. If you would like to, please indicate yes or no whether you think that some version of the Build Back Better Act will pass in 2022. While you're thinking about that, I'm also going to offer a kind of metaphor for the Build Back Better Act. And it has come to mind that maybe 70 years ago, there was a science fiction film made called The Incredibly Shrinking Man. And 30 years after that, in the 1980s, as I understand it, there was a sequel. It took a while for that to come out, called The Incredible Shrinking Woman. And I think in 2021, we experienced another sequel, or two of them, that we could refer to as the incredibly shrinking, big and bold legislation that we started 2021 with. And I'm seeing some responses in the chat box to our first question about the Build Back Better Act. Will some version of it pass? And I think all of us understand that if we are willing to say yes, we believe that it will be an incredibly small version of what we started 2021 envisioning. And it, as we will discuss later, might also include some kind of dissection with individual pieces of it presented for a vote in the Senate. Stay tuned for that. Question number 2. This will be the last question for the beginning of our meeting as we're onboarding and getting ready to go. Another yes or no question. Do you think that in 2022, some version of the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will pass? I'm seeing yes and no. No, 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 not sure, less optimistic. When we think about this, I imagine that all of us are thinking how you have to have a majority to pass a vote, and also thinking how in the Senate it means a filibuster proof majority of 60 votes. And yes. I want to thank you all again for being here today. I'm going to share my screen now and begin with our presentation, and promise to you, I hope I can keep this promise, that we, 4 presenters, will each spend 10 minutes on our presentations. I, Bruce Murray, chair of the Progressive Caucus, will be talking a little bit about the Build Back Better Act. And then Sue Alksness, vice chair of our caucus, will be talking about healthcare and also to some extent the healthcare aspects of Build Back Better. Then Angela Fobbs, who is joining us today, serving the many functions she does, but also as a leader of the DAECCC, which is having its launch event tomorrow, and she will give us a little bit more information about that to talk about climate change. And then actually the fourth presenter has 15 minutes, and that is Bruce Miller. He is our voting rights specialist in the Progressive Caucus, and he is going to talk to us about accountability for the Capitol insurrection, federal voting rights, legal fights against suppression laws, and getting out the vote. We're also going to be thinking all the time, where do we go from here? What next steps are necessary and what action can we take? And without further delay, let's dig into it. How did we get here? I'm going to use the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 approach for this. We've experienced 4 decades of neoliberal trickle-down negligence. And in 2020, after so many decades of that, there were 3 presidential responses. The nominees, or the candidates, Trump, Biden, and Sanders, all had their approaches. And Biden and Sanders then united with forming 6 task force groups. They recommended big, bold recommendations. That was already in the summer of 2020. And we entered 2021 with a new presidency and high hopes. We noticed in the second half of the year, and even more so at the end of the year, that 2 cantankerous senators got in our way. And we still, in 2022, have 1 chance to get it right. Time is short and patience is thin. We started with big, bold plans. The American Rescue Plan, those 1.9, 2.3 are the billions or trillions of dollars that were originally earmarked to be spent on them. The American Jobs Plan, American Families Plan. Remember that these all were to be spread over 10 years, and all of them put together amount to less than the amount we will spend over the next 10 years on defense. And we also had the Made in America tax plan with revenue coming in, people paying their fair share to fund these plans. Then came the acts. The American Rescue Plan, which passed early in the year, was very impressive, but as we always understood, is temporary. Some provisions have already expired at the beginning of 2022. COVID relief was very ambitious and worked well until new variants threw a wrench in the works for that, and we know what that's about now at the beginning of 2022. The federal minimum wage increase was nixed by the parliamentarian and also by senators who weren't willing to adjust to that. And unused funds are being repurposed now for other acts, including the Invest in Jobs and Infrastructure Act. So that Invest in Jobs and Infrastructure Act grew out of the American Jobs Plan. The original provision was for 2.3. Watch the incredible shrinking take place, subject to bipartisan negotiations. Boom, it got cut by more than half. And the final figure amounted to only $550 billion in new spending spread over many years, with much of the funding being repurposed or actually being spending that would have taken place otherwise. And with that bipartisan effort, not all, but many of the climate provisions were eliminated. Then we moved on in the second half of the year, especially the last quarter, thinking more, working harder, negotiating intensely on the Build Back Better Act. The incredibly shrinking process happened again. It started out with a proposal of $6 trillion spread out over a decade, decreased to 3.5. Senator Manchin at one point was talking about 1.5. At the very end of the year, he seemed to increase his offer to 1.8, but then said, and oh no, I don't want to support the Build Back Better Act. He was opposing clean energy and other provisions. Senator Sinema also corporate tax rate increases and the negotiation of pharmaceutical prices. There has been some talking, negotiation on some of those items, but no deals. So where are we now? The Biden-Harris administration is resetting its sights, thinking about also passing parts of the Build Back Better Act. Senator Sanders is calling for votes quickly to make it clear who is supporting what. And our Congressional Progressive Caucus is demanding that we fulfill 5 priorities. And we know what Senators Manchin and Sinema are doing. I want to just draw your attention to those priorities: strengthen the care economy, ensure affordable housing, improve healthcare, tackle climate change, and enable citizenship for essential workers. Where do we go from here? There's a senator in the US Senate who you'll, I think, imagine who has this kind of language, who says, now is the time for a major course correction. Now is the time for Senate Democrats to put legislation on the floor that addresses the needs of working families and challenge Republicans to vote against these important and popular initiatives. Now is the time to rally the American people around an agenda that works for all, not just the 1%. That was taken from an opinion piece that was published in the last 24 hours by CNN. So, calls to action. It's important for each of us and all of our friends, and we've said this before and we'll say it again, to message our senators and our representatives to demand action now. It's also important for us to use our social media outlets to get the word out and to increasingly echo the message we're hearing, that in addition to messaging, calling, we have to organize demonstrations. We have to participate in demonstrations. We have to mobilize the American people. We also have a long game that includes the Global Progressive Caucus of Democrats Abroad. That includes our issue advocacy team for the midterms and beyond, helping to build the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is close to being half of the entire Democratic caucus in the House. Someday soon, it might be half or more. And we are going to be putting chat links for your approval into the chat box during our meeting today. And that includes an RSVP for our monthly members meeting on February 5th, where we'll be talking action, and an invitation to fill out and submit our proDA member engagement form. All right, we're going to move on to healthcare. Sue Elksness, Vice Chair of proDA, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, so here's what I'm just gonna go through what our goal is, the Unity Task Force recommendations, what happened with the Build Back Better Act and where we're at now, as well as some next steps and calls to action. So, yeah, so I mean, we know many of us, Medicare for All was first introduced by Rep. John Conyers in 2003. Was also introduced by Pramila Jayapal in 2021. After the meeting, you'll get a link to the legislation, the 2021 legislation. It has 118 co-sponsors, and it's been referred to 7 committees, and also Senator Sanders has introduced it in the Senate in both 2017 and 2019. So in 2020, when the Unity Task Force did its work after the Democratic presidential primary, the healthcare portion of the Unity Task Force included these many recommendations related to healthcare. I draw your attention to the public option, which many people see as a backdoor to Medicare for All, with the hope that once there's a public option, which is kind of like a mini Medicare for All, that's like accessible to those who want to enroll in that, that's provided through the government, that might be more affordable and better service than private care or private insurance Although for myself, I actually think that's kind of a risky approach as well, that can be undermined and set up for failure. But it also removed barriers, recommended removing barriers to statewide universal health. So that could be a plus, reducing drug prices and other things that would help the American people. Then the healthcare legislation action that happened in 2021, we had the American Rescue Plan Act. Keep in mind that's temporary, but under that plan, the healthcare related elements include these things you see here: the COVID relief, mental health and substance abuse disorder supports. Under the ACA modernization there, the middle bullet, those were grants to modernize systems, programs, or other technology. And there was also an expansion of the premium tax credits for health insurance. It's purchased through an exchange. So they weren't really, to my view, like really major changes, but there was in Medicaid a nice expansion for pregnant women from 60 days of coverage to 12 months postpartum. So that was in there. And then the Build Back Better Act. So on life support ? I suppose on life support would be the what we would hope for at this point. So here's what's left of this patient. We don't, the lower Medicare age of eligibility to 60 has gone out. We doubt that Medicare being able to negotiate prices for prescription drugs is going to stay in. Don't know. The original proposal to have Medicare with the who it currently serves, have that coverage include hearing, eyesight, and dental. At this point, maybe we'll have hearing. So maybe we'll have hearing. And who knows on expanding the Affordable Care Act. And certainly there's debate about whether expanding the Affordable Care Act heads us toward Medicare for all or not. So where are we now with that Build Back Better Act? So as of January 18th, Reuters reported that the White House is seeking to reset talks on its $1.75 trillion spending bill, aiming to salvage the climate change measures, but pare down or cut items like the child tax credit and paid family leave in order to appeal to U.S. Senator Joe Manchin and other Democrats as soon as this week, said two people working on the plan. So in terms of next steps and calls to action, there is a lot of grassroots work happening around Medicare for all. It doesn't always get the coverage in the mainstream media. And one might say it doesn't ever get coverage in the mainstream media, but it's out there, it's happening, and it's exciting, and it's laying the groundwork for big change. So here's a few things that we can do. Coming up on January 27th, there's a progressive summit that the Congressional Progressive Caucus is helping to organize, and that's January 27th from 1 to 5 Eastern time. So the earlier sessions are accessible for folks in Europe. None of it's very good for anyone in AP, Asia Pacific, that is. There's lots of efforts happening in states. So in California right now, universal health care, a single payer system for California is in the state assembly for discussion. And if it can pass the assembly by the end of the month, it has a chance to go on to potentially become legislation. There's a rush to the end of the month because the legislation was introduced last year. So there's a time limit on how long it can be in the state assembly. So we'll provide links for that if anyone wants to share with their California contacts, or if we got some California voters on the call, maybe you can chime in support of that. I don't know exactly where things stand in Florida, but I can tell you that there's a town hall coming up February 24th on Medicare for All for Florida. And we'll provide a link to tune into that. And you can also, there's also the National Nurses United Medicare for All campaigns, which are very successful and have a lot of action and enthusiasm behind them. And Public Citizen is organizing a countrywide effort to pass local Medicare for All resolutions. The value of this is that it gets a conversation going at the local level, gets people thinking about Medicare, learning that it's feasible, that it's something that we can do. Simple ideas like, well, if we can organize a public school system, can't we organize something like Medicare for All? If we already have the Medicare program, why can't we do it on a broader basis? So we'll provide some links to that. You can see all the little markers for everywhere across the country where those are in the works. I will also add that voting in primaries and in general elections is important, especially supporting candidates who support Medicare for All and joining candidate campaigns when the candidates are working for these things. And you can join proDA's Medicare for All advocacy team. That's it on healthcare. I hope that was 10 minutes. Ooh, I think I came in under.
So I think that was 8 or 9 minutes. Very, very impressive. It gives me 1 minute before we go on to the next presentation to say all of what you're seeing right now will be in the proDA Facebook page tomorrow. And if you look at this slide, you'll see that there are many items that are underlined. That means that those are links. And if you have trouble finding links in the chat box today and say, oh, or maybe you misplace it, you can go to Facebook tomorrow and click on any one of these underlined items and you'll go directly to the source. And that first one with Representative Jayapal, she's going to be the first presenter in the first panel in that Progressive Strategy Summit on January 27th. And you can probably imagine that she's pretty intensely desiring that we work with her on Medicare for All and other things because of the work that the Congressional Progressive Caucus did under her leadership was getting burned by the end of the year with no Build Back Better Act so far. All right, we're going to continue now with a focus on climate change. And Angela Fobbs is once again coming to us also from the DAECCC, and she might tell us what that acronym stands for.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Yes, the DAECCC is the Democrats Abroad, Environmental and Climate Crisis Council. It has the same name as the DNC group. So we just took the same name that they did. And in fact, we'll be having an event tomorrow with the chair of the DNC-ECCC. So we hope you can join us. I'll put the link in the chat later. With climate change, as you know, it is a crisis at this point, and we have to take action immediately. We have some good ideas. We have the progressive goal of the Green New Deal, which I don't know if you've seen the video that AOC made. That was a really good example of what they're striving for. We have the Unity Task Force recommendations, which Biden and the Sanders camp negotiated. And out of that came the need for the investment in infrastructure and the Jobs Act and Build Back Better. Next slide, please. So the Green New Deal is a really great idea, and I wish we could have started on it a lot sooner, but there's still time to get net zero by 2050. It would be great if we could get close to that by 2030. But that might be just wishful thinking at this point. It would provide millions of good high-wage jobs. It would upgrade our infrastructure to meet the 21st century challenges. And yeah, crisis might not be a strong enough term, but I don't want to like freak out at the moment. So we'll call it a crisis. But to meet the infrastructure needs of the 21st century, because in all honesty, we haven't had any large investments in infrastructure in decades. I mean, maybe not until at least until the 60s or since the 60s or 70s, really. So everybody lives outside of the United States. You see when you go to America that it is so, basically denigrated as far as where our public services, airports, roads, bridges, and this is a desperate need for us to tackle this problem. And yes, we need to go back a little bit. Wait, Bruce. One more back. There we go. I think, there we are. Yeah, the need to secure clean air and water is incredibly important. We have several cities in the United States that have problems. There are actually many places in the United States that don't have clean water for one reason or another. People don't have access to healthy food or access to nature. Next slide, please. So the Unity Task Force recommendation that we did rejoin the Paris Agreement. That's a positive step forward. I'm not really sure if it at this point means anything substantive. We are hopefully, we have Deb Harlan as she is the Interior Secretary, so perhaps we'll have she's our first Native American person to hold the position of Secretary of the Interior. I think that's a positive step. We could create millions of green jobs and establish the Green Corps, which would be it's actually what we need, that we need a force of people who are just working on remediating things having to do with climate change, repairing buildings, upgrading various things. And without that, we're going to have a real big problem. Next slide. So the investment in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So we've got a proposed investment that was cut in half, but I guess it's better than nothing. Although it did eliminate a lot of the climate provisions, which I believe that was Joe Manchin that wanted to get rid of a lot of the climate provisions in that. Next slide, please. All right, what's left? There are still some good things left. Investment in public transportation, investment in passenger rail, which the United States desperately needs. It would be really great to be able to go home and then get off the plane in New York and then take a train to where I want to go and get there fast. Not have it. Right now, if you take Amtrak, I can't even imagine how long it takes to go from like New York to Texas or something on Amtrak, if you can even do it. We need to definitely to fix our bridges and our roads, because I think our bridges are all they were graded D or less, and by the engineering society that issues this. And we've had in the past few years bridges that have actually collapsed and fell. So it's very important, investment in clean water and waste infrastructure. And we also need to get our green energy transmission lines together. If you look at what happened to Texas last year, they actually weirdly have a lot of green energy, but we don't have, I don't even want to talk about Texas, it's so weird, but we don't have a way to transmit all this energy across the country, even if we got it together. And then, of course, the idea of electrifying all the buses and the school buses and public transportation. Plus, I believe that the Biden administration wants to have electric vehicles for all the agencies in the government by a certain date. I'm not sure what the date is. It's probably 2030. But yes, we have to rebuild to get a resilient and clean electric grid. Next slide. Okay, Build Back Better, which when I initially heard that expression, I thought, this sounds really great, Build Back Better. But obviously there are a lot of people that, like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, that don't particularly care for this. It would give incentives to homeowners to install rooftop solar and insulate their homes to be more energy efficient, which is going to be super important as climate change goes on, especially with the extreme heat incidents that keep happening around the country. It's going to give rebates for people to buy electric cars. I think that 12,500 could be a little higher. It's not, a lot of electric cars are quite expensive right now, although in 2023, you're going to see a whole lot more electric cars hit the market that are going to be more reasonably priced. And also give companies tax rebates for manufacturing in the United States of solar panels, because right now, I think China is leading the world in solar panel manufacture, and we could actually do that, and that would provide people in our country with a lot of really good jobs. And it would also be a level of security that we don't have to depend on another nation like China to, so that we can be energy independent. Next slide. So yeah, where are we now? Well, a lot of people are talking about breaking it down into smaller bills, or maybe we won't have any deal or a climate breakout. But what would be ideal is if we could just pass the whole thing in bulk, because we can't wait anymore before we start doing something with climate change. Next slide. All right, so our next steps, of course, definitely support the Green New Deal and also the Thrive Agenda. I talked about that on, I don't know if it was the last update, but it was a couple of months ago. And so yes, definitely support the Sunrise Movement. And if you would like, the ECCC is having our first event tomorrow at, I want to say it's at 3 o'clock Central European time. And also, it would be really great. We also started our hashtag climate vote initiative, and we are looking for people to make videos that express why climate change, why they're voting for the climate. So that, because honestly, if the Republicans take back the House or the Senate, we will not get anything done, and it will be years, and that will be devastating. So it'd be, if you would like to participate in our hashtag climate vote initiative, please go ahead and check it out. There's a form that you fill out just so that we know that you're going to send a video. And then we'll go from there. But you have to speak out. You have to speak out about climate change, because there is a study or a poll, and 1 out of 3 Americans is concerned about climate change. So that means 2/3 of us, it's not a big deal for them. They don't care, and they should care, because we're a small enough group, because we're all going to die if it's recorded, so okay, fine. We're not going to survive this in the long term if we don't start taking steps today. So thank you.
Angela, thank you very much. And I'm on your side talking about the serious of what we have at hand. We saw it in the bipartisan passed bill that there were a number of provisions that could be described as climate change mitigation provisions, That is really the tip of the iceberg. There's so much that we need to do, and there's so much that needs to have been done yesterday, 5 years ago. We're playing catch up now, and there is the possibility to tip the balance and accelerate. And that's what the United Nations is trying to accomplish now. And each and every one of us has a role to play. We also hope that the Progressive Caucus will be able to join the DAECCC in organizing an Earth Day event toward the end of March. It's like March 22nd this year. And we're saying Earth Day? No. Earth Week? No. At least Earth Month.
It's Earth Month, yes, for sure. It's going to be Earth Month this month. And can I just say one more thing? I know there aren't that many people on this call, but people watching, it would be super if everyone could support our social media. You know, we're a new caucus. We don't have that many followers or likes. And in order to amplify our message and deal with the gods of the algorithm, we need to have more people. So if you could please I put the information in the chat. If you could just please go to our social media and like, subscribe, whatever. Thanks.
Thanks again, Angela. I said that this presentation will be available on Facebook tomorrow. When I finish sharing the screen with this presentation, I'm also going to put the link to this presentation in the chat box so you don't have to wait. We're going to go now to voting rights, Bruce, who hails from Linz, Austria, but I think originally from California, and who has been working hard and long for us, not only with this presentation, but posting in our proDA Facebook page every week on Monday with voting rights information. Take it away, Bruce.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. So in our presentation today, we are framing the voting rights fight as being on 4 different fronts. The first one of them is the push for accountability for the Capitol insurrection on January 6th of last year. The second is federal voting rights legislation, which of course has been in the news very much for the last couple of weeks. The third front is extremely important as the legal fights going on against voter suppression laws and practices that our private parties are bringing. And the National Justice Department, where it still can, is also active in this, and also states attorneys general that can bring cases as well. So that's all ongoing, and they have to bring cases when the state legislatures pass these laws, and the fight against them in the state legislatures is lost. And the fourth front is the registration and get out the vote effort for the 2022 elections. So, and by the way, the Democrats abroad have really been active on this already this year. And Marjorie, I think you posted on the WhatsApp phone bank group last week that at one point this week, there were 4 people from Austria who were in the top 10 phone bankers worldwide for Democrats abroad. So that's already underway. So now, what links all 4 slides, or all 4 fronts really, is 2 concepts: voter suppression and election subversion. And those are 2 phrases that everybody needs to be familiar with this year. And we, on the following slide, we've put a link to a very good ProPublica panel that was broadcast on the anniversary or the 1-year mark, we should say, maybe, of the insurrection last year. It does a very good job of linking all of these 4 fronts. And one of the participants in the panel is Jocelyn Benson. She's the Michigan Secretary of State, and she is very clear and pointed in how she's been stressing the urgency of defending voting rights. Now, the state attorneys general state secretaries of state are usually the ones in charge of administering elections. And that's a task that has been generally considered so standard bureaucratic process and generally boring that often people are not sure what a Secretary of State at the state level even does. But now that's very different because, among other things, the Republicans are going after state and local offices involved in administering elections. And those jobs are now a whole lot more dramatic and important than they ever really should have been. So now I'm responding to January the 6th. The insurrection last year was very much an election subversion attempt. It aimed to have Congress override the results of the Electoral College and retain Donald Trump as president. Now, there are currently prosecutions and congressional investigations underway addressing the legal and political accountability of participants. Now, the legal issues and political accountability are very important, but here, what we really wanted to stress is important to remember the January 6th insurrection was very much an election subversion attempt. So, on to the three major pieces of legislation. In the annual meeting event a couple of weeks ago, several people had questions about exactly what the voting rights laws are all about. So we wanted to take some time today to spell that out a little more. So I came up with some descriptive nicknames for each of the three major bills. The Freedom to Vote Act could also be called the Stop the Republicans from Using Dirty Tricks to Take Away Your Vote Act. The John L. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act could be called the John Lewis Stop Republicans Racist Redistricting Act. And those two you probably heard a lot about during the last week. The third is the Electoral Count Act, reform of which should be called the Require Republicans to Count Presidential Votes Honestly Act. Now, the congressional process on this has been confusing because of the various procedural and negotiating elements that have been involved. But if you were following the news on the voting rights showdown this over the last week in the Senate, you probably noticed that they were talking about the voting rights bill that was at issue. And that's because in the last round, the House and Senate voted on a single bill which combined the Freedom to Vote and the John Lewis Act. And at least they titled the combined bill the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act. But here I'm going to talk about those two as separate items because they did run on separate tracks until this past week. So now the Freedom to Vote Act provides some explicit measures against the various kinds of voter suppression efforts that the Republicans have used in the last couple of decades. All of those are essentially variations on voter suppression tactics used in the South during the Jim Crow years, because the former Confederate states couldn't just flat out outlaw Black people voting, but they came up with voter suppression tactics to achieve that goal by different means. So this law, I should mention, also does have some very important provisions on visibility and accountability for campaign financing. And Sheldon Whitehouse, the senator from Rhode Island, has been very prominent in pushing that aspect. Now, the John Lewis Act, it restores, the big thing about it, restores the pre-clearance function to the federal government that the Supreme Court in 2003 struck out of the 2006 Renewal version of the Voting Rights Act. This was the most important enforcement mechanism from the original 1965 Voting Rights Act up to and including the 2006 Voting Rights Act, which extended this for 20 years, but in 2013, the Supreme Court knocked that out and essentially went a long way toward defanging the Voting Rights Act. The pre-clearance requires federal review and approval of new voting rights laws in states and other areas, smaller areas, with a demonstrated history of racial discrimination in voting practices. And that would have to come before those laws could go into effect. And Brendan brought up something that I just learned about first a couple of days ago, that apparently Texas is trying to make it harder for people living abroad to vote in Texas elections. And this is just an example of the kinds of things that are being used by the Republicans in Republican-dominated states. The John L. Lewis bill also restores the discrimination standard. In other words, the standard of proof that you have to meet to declare a voting practice racially discriminatory, that the Supreme Court also diluted just last year in a decision in July. So, I mean, it's probably important. We don't have any good picture of where the process is going right now, because the defeat of the filibuster change last week, which would have been necessary to have the votes, to have the voting rights bills actually go to Biden for signature, was just a couple of days ago. Right now, it seems like the chances for passing that legislation this year are dim, but surprises do happen, and this is really an urgent thing. I mean, short of the Archangel Gabriel appearing personally to Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and telling them to get their act together, it's hard to see at this point how they will go along with it. But federal voting rights legislation is just not a fight that the Democratic Party and supporters of democracy in general can afford to give up on. The voting rights legislation, federal voting rights legislation, is an urgent need, and Democrats all the way from base voters to members of Congress really need to treat it that way. So we haven't heard yet from the congressional leadership or from the Progressive Caucus about where they want to go on that in the immediate future. Now, I also wanted to talk about the Electoral Count Act. And you may have heard that the last couple of weeks coming up from Republicans. Mitch McConnell has been talking about it. Mitt Romney was pitching it on Meet the Press this past Sunday. And it has to do with a law that most of us don't remember ever hearing about before just recently, the Electoral Count Act. And this is a law from 1877 that regulates how Congress counts the Electoral College vote and how the states should report those votes into Congress. The presidential election that year, 1876, wound up in a horrible mess, so Congress passed this law to regulate it. Now, there are two reasons that we're hearing about it now, after never having to hear about it in our whole lives. One is that the thing actually does need to be cleaned up in terms of the procedures. But the other is that the Republicans are talking this up as a bipartisan compromise on voting rights. But the key thing to know when this comes up, if the Republicans keep pushing that as a compromise at this point, is that every Congress since 1877 that's had to count a presidential vote has passed a joint resolution declaring that they would follow the electoral count law, because that has created a record of Congress saying a law can't regulate congressional procedures because the Constitution specifically says that Congress can regulate its own procedures. So this is, to the extent that it could be cleaned up, that would be a good thing to do. And if passing a new law would at least make it marginally harder in a January 6th type situation for Congress to just ignore it. And there is another reform too, in terms of requiring the states to respect the results of a popular vote in the presidential election when they're selecting electors, members for the Electoral College, because the way it's set up in the Constitution, it's actually the state legislature that selects the electors. And some of the Republicans have been pushing to give the state legislatures the option to just ignore the popular vote and proceed to select the electors that they want. And so a new piece of legislation could address that as part of a reform of the Electoral Count Act, but it's probably not very likely that the Republicans will go for that. Now, we wanted to quickly mention a few of the voter suppression tactics that have been used. The one that Bruce just put up here is something that the Texas GOP actually tweeted out saying, no, if you libs can stand in line to get a COVID vaccination, then people can stand in line to vote. This is an important voter suppression tactic of making it hard for people to get in to vote. And of course, the Republicans use this tactic particularly in areas with high concentrations of people that Mitch McConnell might not consider real Americans. We've given several examples here. I just wanted to quickly mention the voting rights, or excuse me, the voter ID concept, which sounds kind of benign, but it's one that can easily be manipulated. So, for instance, a white guy comes into the polling place and he's forgotten his voter ID, and he asks, do I need my voter ID to vote? Do I have to show it? And a white precinct worker can say, oh, no, Barney, I know you. Here's your ballot. Go on in and vote. But then if a non-white voter shows up who also has forgotten her ID and asks, oh, do I need to show my voter ID to vote? That same precinct worker can say, well, I'm sorry, but you have to present your voter ID to vote. That's the law. And the big thing about the voter suppression tactics is that it's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts approach. The idea is to put enough barriers up that a number of people will be blocked from voting. And if you keep in mind that in the famous Georgia election and the presidential vote last year, the difference between the difference in the presidential race and the popular vote was like 12,000 votes. So, and there's over 2 million registered African-American voters in Georgia. So it would take way less than 1% of voters to be denied the ability to vote by these voter suppression tactics to flip the state's vote in a presidential election. And we also have an information slide in there about election subversion, which basically refers to tampering with the legitimate results of an election. And the classic old school example would be stuffing the ballot box, just putting in a bunch of non-legitimate ballots marked for the favored candidate. But there's other ways that state officials and state legislators can meddle with the vote as well, and that's what people are talking about when they refer to election subversion. So those two concepts, voter suppression and election subversion, are what we're up against at all of these levels. And getting out the vote to elect people who will protect the right to vote is extremely important in this year, and that's why we're calling this the four fronts. So thank you. I went a little bit over, sorry about that, but back to you, Chair Bruce.
Thank you very much. Voting rights, Bruce. And I'm amazed that you could do that in the time that you used, because it is at least four fronts. And there's so much going on, and there's so many things to be aware of. It's not as simple as just saying, well, we all have the right to vote and everyone can just go to the local polling station and that takes care of it. There are so many ways to suppress the vote and also to subvert elections. And although it would be great if we didn't have to worry about it, the truth of the matter is we do. And that is what we are going about today and moving forward. All right, I want to thank all of our presenters now, and we have ample time now to talk with one another, and we can refer to anything we've heard And my invitation to everyone here, we're a relatively small group, would be to give you an opportunity to either raise your hand as I'm doing right now, or use your tool here to raise your hand like that. Or if you wish to do something else, maybe even put star hand up in the chat box. We'll keep an eye out. And in this first period, I would just like to invite anyone who wishes to react to anything. And please feel free to express confusion or frustration, anger. But remember, don't forget hope and the will to change. I'd like that to be a part of the mix. And who would like to get the ball rolling? Brendan, could you also tell us where you're residing and where you vote?
Yeah, my name is Brendan Reed. I live in Woodstock, Ontario, Canada, and I vote in NJ's CD3 in Bordentown City.
All right, take it away.
Yeah, question is regarding Medicare for all. Could we have the issue of ending Medicare Part B penalties for returning Americans? This is a kind of a real and personal issue. 2 years ago, I had a heart attack, underwent heart surgery, and my wife, who was retired, was facing the very real possibility, if I died, having to go back to the U.S., but she would have had to pay some severe penalties under Part B for doing so if she had to go back home.
Brendan, I recently turned 65. Actually, now it's almost 3 years ago. And even so, I'm still familiarizing myself with Medicare. And I think there are A, B, C, D. Could you describe a little more specifically what Medicare B is?
Well, Medicare B is the addition. I mean, we all get Medicare A, but Medicare B is the add-ons for for doctors' visits, for cover what a lot of what Part A doesn't cover, and that is a cost that's if you're in the U.S. you pay for the Part B coverage. But when you return to the U.S. and if you're retired, they actually assess a penalty for you for the years that you were retired, but you were out of the country, or for the time since you were 65 before, but weren't taking it, but decided to take it.
Wow.
And not. But those penalties add up over years.
Brendan, I have a thought. Are you aware of Democrats Abroad Medicare Portability Task Force?
Yes, I'm also a member of the Information Seniors Caucus.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I wonder if the Medicare Portability Task Force within DA is aware of this issue that you're raising, and whether maybe that would be something for you to bring to their attention. They could maybe include that in their mandate. Okay. For those who don't know, do you want to tell people what the Medicare Portability Task Force is, Brendan?
Yeah, I'm aware. I'm acquainted with who's the contact there.
I think we can give you a bunch of different ones. Heather in Israel is probably the best one.
Okay, I'm acquainted. I've been acquainted with Heather, so yeah.
Yeah, I would contact Heather about it. So for those who don't know, the Medicare Portability Task Force is working on the idea that folks who live outside of the U.S. Who are eligible for Medicare would be able to access healthcare where they are, but have reimbursements through the Medicare program in the U.S. because people are forced to pay into the Medicare program anyway, regardless of that they're out of the country. It's a short form.
I'd like to mention too that as I was approaching 65, I thought it would be great to be on Medicare, and I do. But living outside the country, my access to it is completely limited. And it is true that I do pay a monthly fee, as we all do, that currently is, I think, about between $170 and $180 a month in 2022. And that means that if I want to avail myself of Medicare, I have to go back to the United States and seek that service there.
Wow. Bruce, we have Cliff with a question if we're ready to move on. from Brendan's comment.
I'd also just like to conclude what Brendan had to say, also by mentioning that we are developing a Medicare for All task force in our proDA group. We want to work together with the Medicare Portability Task Force and the Seniors Caucus and the Disabilities Caucus on an event covering healthcare and Medicare for All in March. So we would welcome Brendan's and anyone else's help in getting us on the right trajectory for that. You can always write to us at proDA@democratsabroad.org, and we'll respond quickly. Cliff.
Hi, thanks. My name's Cliff. I live in Germany. I'm a Michigan voter. Angela, this comment and question is kind of directed at you. I was astounded by the number that you cited from that article on phys.org about only 1 in 3 Americans are concerned about the effects of climate change and the crisis facing us. Do you think that that's because they don't have time to worry about that? The study is citing December 2020 to September 2021. What was happening then? We were in a pandemic. Do you think that if we had adequate healthcare where people could take time off to be sick, they might have a chance to notice the effects of climate change creeping upon them at an ever increasing rate? And I mean, I'm really glad that you brought the number into stark relief like that, 1 in 3. That's way too low. Oh my God, that's way too low. More people need to be concerned about that. Do you predict like a chain of, or maybe stepping stones towards realization that this has to happen too? And maybe if we do infrastructure or healthcare and other progressive topics, that enables people to have the brain space for climate change, and maybe it's too late.
Well, I don't think that it's just that people don't have the time, because climate things are happening. I mean, remember there was that tornado that went across 4 states, just a few. That's a focus of that's climate change. Tornadoes. I mean, I grew up in Ohio, Southern Ohio, which is tornado country. Things like that didn't used to happen, where, I mean, a tornado that went across 4 states, that's not normal. People are experiencing climate change, but I think that there's been so much doubt that's been put into the public mind that the science, there are still people that believe that the science isn't settled, that all scientists don't agree on this, and also people are not tying together the weather events with climate change. And I think if you started to tie the events that are happening, a few years ago, there were in the Northwest, Midwest, there were these huge floods that affected a lot of farmers. This was extremely unusual, but people didn't tie it to climate change. And so as long as you don't have the connection between this hurricane happens or this storm happens and this is a part of climate change, people won't see it. And I think we have to make more connections with the things, the heat dome that was over the Northwest, that put a place that never hardly has temperatures, that are in the 90s, let alone over 100 degrees. That was climate change. We have to tie these things together so that people understand that it's not climate change isn't some nebulous thing that's, that we can't define or that we can't see the results of. And once more people do that, I mean, plus also the progressive things to give people a break, so they don't have to worry so much about other stuff. But as long as we don't tie the things that are happening together with climate change, I think people will always just be like, oh yeah, I'm concerned about it, but not so really. Yeah.
I'm going to pass the baton to Sue with a comment. And that is to mention that there's an aspect of seeing that requires wanting to see. And often when there are things that are happening that aren't so good, one of our inclinations is to look away and not want to see it. And I think that that is a factor too, because climate change mitigation is perceived, I think rightly so, not only as something that requires action, but it requires us to change our ways and how we live. And there are many of us who, and myself included, who think twice about changing the way I live. We have to want to see. Sue?
Thanks, Bruce. I threw in the chat a link to the Yale program on climate change communication. And they have some really, really helpful resources there, including some very important work they've been doing, looking at like what are the characteristics of people who are climate deniers? What are the characteristics of people who who embrace that it's an imminent disaster? And so that and what kind of communication and messages will actually get people to take it seriously who are not taking it seriously. And Angela's comment about things that people are experiencing in real time aligns with the research that Yale is sharing. And another area has to do with diseases. So there are diseases that are vector-borne diseases with typically insects, ticks, mosquitoes, and the range of the host animals for those insects is changing, and the range for the insects is changing. And so diseases are coming into parts of America that haven't been here before. Well, I'm in Canada, but it's the same in Canada as well, and threatening humans. And for a lot of people, the threat of those diseases coming to their area, which again, like the big violent weather events, are not things that people can just avoid by having money to protect them, right? It affects everyone. Although we don't want to say really that that's true, as we know with diseases like COVID. Started out that way, but it's more been Black and brown people and others in service and frontline industries that have been hit the hardest. That's what I wanted to share.
I want to invite everyone in this next phase also to think about where it is that we're living abroad. And if we think in our guest countries, in Europe or wherever, there are some things that are happening that we think are better than is what is happening in the United States, addressing the needs of working families, citizens in general, also dealing with climate change. Are there any examples out there that you see that you think might be a good idea for us to take a look at in the United States?
Well, we think about that. Brendan has a comment to share from the chat, and I hope we get some folks speaking up about what Bruce mentioned. For sure, there's some good examples, I think, around the world. Brendan, did you want to share your comment?
Okay, now this is referring back to voting rights. And now that BIPOC's passed, and of course, states are responsible for voter registration, setting electoral boundaries and so forth. I was wondering, though, if there would be appetite in Congress to connect voting rights with federal highway spending. And I say highways for a specific reason, because every state wants highway money. And the reason for that is actually namely states that suppress voting rights don't get federal dollars. And there's actually precedent for this. I believe it was in 1984 that Congress passed legislation that tied the raising of drinking age, which is again like electoral rights, it's a state responsibility, to 21, and tied it to federal highway spending. Namely, if you don't raise your drinking age to 21, you will not get federal highway dollars. So I'm just curious, just throwing it out there, whether that similar type of approach may work, because one of the arguments against the changes in voting rights legislation, well, it's a state's responsibility guaranteed by the Constitution and so forth. Whereas in other countries like Canada, it's a federal responsibility. Elections Canada manages and does a great job. I have dual citizenship. I vote in the Canadian elections, so it's a simpler and easier process. Anyway, but I was wondering if that kind of approach may work and may even gain some traction.
Bruce Miller?
Yeah, Brendan, what I think any maneuver or device that Congress can come up with to address voter suppression tactics and election subversion approach would be good. And if they can do it by some backdoor way collected the funding, that would be great. But I think the key thing here to remember is how drastically the Republican Party position on this has shifted. So I mentioned the 2006 renewal of the Voting Rights Act. You may have heard Biden talk about how he convinced Strom Thurmond to vote for one version of renewing of the Voting Rights Act. That was an earlier one. But in the 2006 renewal, it had pre-clearance. I mean, it had the stuff in the voting rights bill that had been in there since 1965, and the vote in the Senate for that extension, the 2006 extension, which was for 20 years. So the 20 years haven't run out from that point yet. The vote in the Senate was 98-0 in favor of the extension of the Voting Rights Act. And in the House, there were some Republicans that voted against it, but it was less than 10% of the Republican caucus. So 15 years ago, the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which is basically what we're talking about restoring here, restoring a system that had been in place since 1965 and worked well. In 15 years, the Republican Party has shifted to what we saw in this vote. They're all against it. And in the Senate, that was one thing I think was a good outcome of the showdown that Chuck Schumer staged in the Senate, because you saw there, it's like all 50 Democrats voted for the law. 2 of the 50 Democrats voted against the change in the filibuster rule, which it would take to actually make it law. But all 50 of the Republicans voted against it. There was the John Lewis Act. I think Lisa Murkowski did originally vote for it on its own. So I mean, we really have. I like this term that there's a political scientist, Norman Ornstein, who's on Twitter a lot. He's worth following. He really stresses that the polarization in the parties we're seeing is very much an asymmetric polarization, and this is the best illustration that I can think of on that, of how what was absolutely vanilla, you can barely think of voting against it, position on voting rights just 15 years ago, is the Republicans have now completely rejected that and are staking their strategy, their electoral strategy, on voter suppression and election subversion. And so my thought is that's more important to them at this point than even highway funds. So I don't think they would allow a highway fund bill with that restriction to go through. It's just,
well, that's
that's the problem.
That's the beauty. You see, that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
Of it is that, oh well, you didn't get your highways. Guess what? But I hear your point. But I think but I hear your point entirely. In fact, maybe we should start talking about the Republic. You start using language like referring to the Republicans as juntas, Republican leadership, and talk about that kind of language, because that's what it is. These are Republican juntas, and that's got a real coded message for our Latinx community. When they see the word junta, they know exactly what that means, and because that's exactly what's happening. And that's just sending a clear message that, folks, in one simple word, this is what's going on. Okay. And talk about it. It is a dictatorship. It is a junta. Each of these states, GOP control, are state juntas.
Do we have someone who would like to continue along this line? I'm tempted myself. Would someone else like to chime in with another comment about voting rights, or go back to trying to look for positive examples to follow and encourage us to adopt in the United States. Oh, that was a close one. We'll go with Faith first and then Sue. Faith, could you also say where you are and where you vote?
Hi there, my name is Faith. I'm Vice Chair of Democrats Abroad Austria. I'm originally from California, but I vote in Missouri. And I guess my comment about the Voting Rights Act is that it was quite a shock, but not so much of a shock. So maybe moving forward, instead of I think maybe Democrats need to shift strategy, and instead of trying to convince the Republicans to work with them, maybe it's time to just focus on getting how many percentage of voters that opted out of the voting process, because we're not going to get any more, we're not going to change any Republican minds at this point. So I think maybe we need to shift and work on getting more individuals registered to vote. What is it, 80, 89 million? I don't know how many millions of people voted, but there are how many eligible voters? I think we need to go after those individuals and go after independents that are not quite so right-leaning. So, it's very, very discouraging that Voting Rights Act that people have bled and died for and have marched for decades was dismantled, and that Democrats that are on our side are supposed to be voted against it. So I think maybe it's time to start putting forward candidates against Sinema and Manchin. So, I mean, I don't know. It's going to be interesting because the statistics are against us. We will lose this midterms. And I mean, historically, unless there's a Hail Mary, we may lose this. We will most likely lose probably the Senate and the House, or some combination of the two, if you look at history. So it's more just I think we need to go back to the coalition that we formed with Obama and maybe trying to add more names to that voice, because I don't really see a way forward, but that's my 2 cents.
That was an excellent stirring of the pot. And I see Sue watched you doing it, and she wants to stir a little more, and so does Bruce Miller.
Yeah.
I love that, Faith. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm not sure how to get those voters. It seems to me like a lot of new voters came in. I don't know, through the Obama coalition, were there a lot of new voters? I'm not sure.
I wouldn't say there were a lot of new voters, but that was where a lot of Republicans who traditionally voted Republicans voted for a Democrat.
Okay, so we got those folks, and then we did get new voters through Bernie. We got a ton, like a big bunch, and it seems like I don't know if we can get a combination deal on that. I mean, one nice thing about Bernie's approach is he sticks pretty strongly to the kind of the economic message. It's kind of universal. I know some progressive activists get concerned about the range of issues that progressive candidates might be concerned about, and that sometimes their positions make folks nervous and make it a little hard for folks to support them, even though I agree with them on all those on all those issues, like the incarceration state, what we have in terms of incarceration in the US now needs to change drastically, but that kind of talk makes some folks nervous. But I don't know, bringing it right down to where we're at in DA, what can we do do people have thoughts on how we can find new voters and bring them in, assuming the candidates and the ideas are there that voters are going to be interested in?
Here we go, off to Bruce Miller, but with a quick comment from me. The Global Women's Caucus, just in another hour or two, is holding the first in a series of events on a topic it wants to attract attention to, and that is what we are challenged to do all the time now, and that is talk to people who don't share our opinions, creating a framing for that and acknowledging other points of view and then pivoting to common ground. And it seems to me this has to be a part of that conversation. Bruce Miller and then Angela.
Yeah, just in following up on Faith's comment, if one thing that's very clear is that it shouldn't be, voting rights should not be a partisan issue. I mean, everybody should agree that the right to vote should be protected. But unfortunately, at the moment, it is a partisan issue, and the Democrats want to protect the vote and the Republicans want to suppress it. But one thing that I'm serious about saying that things could change, and there's possibility that there could be a movement on the Voting Rights Act, the federal voting rights legislation this year, because lots of stuff can happen. For instance, if in the primary voting, for instance, in May and June, if there's really widespread and outrageous acts of voter suppression that comes to light, that could put new pressure on Manchin and Sinema. And again, I'm still hoping for the Archangel Gabriel to show up. But I saw something just today from Josh Marshall in his Talking Points memo. He was reporting on the polls on Kyrsten Sinema's standing in Arizona. And he cited a poll that showed her with 8% approval rating, 8%. And he was basically saying it's almost impossible for a senator to get only an 8% positive approval rating. And his take on it was, given the outrage in the Arizona Democratic Party and given her terrible poll numbers, that it's almost certain that she will lose re-election in 2024, to the extent that you can say that 3 years ahead of time. So this stuff is really important to the Democratic base, and it's a really urgent thing, and it's something that people are aware of. So that's a point in the favor of hope anyway.
All right, I'm keeping my eye on the clock and respecting the deadline at 4:30. So I'm going to ask Angela and Brendan to speak, and then we're going to take a look at a closing slide.
Okay, what I wanted to respond to Faith and what she said about that we're going to lose the midterms. We're not going to lose, because we can. And we need to get more people to vote, but what we really need to do is make sure the people that voted in 2020 will vote again, because that's one of the reasons why we lose, because people are like, I don't want to put any effort into doing anything, and the midterms aren't that important. So I think we have to get everybody to understand that we got rid of Trump, and now we have to get rid of Trumpism. And Trumpism is the rest of the Republican Party. Since they've fallen for his line. And I think, I am not entirely sure that getting more people to vote is the answer. And it's not, I had an experience in the last, in the presidential election cycle. I met this woman at the hairdresser, and I've signed up lots of people at my hairdresser for voting. I just go there and I pass out vote from abroad, and I even help people get registered. So I got this woman registered. She was African-American, but between the time that was in January, because it was in 2020, it was right before the lockdowns. And then I saw her again, January of last year. And I asked her, did she vote? And she said, she was like, yeah. And then I was like, who'd you vote for? Because I don't know. I just had some feeling. And she voted for Trump. Because she had been watching the memes and stuff on social media and in some of these sort of pseudo QAnon groups. And she decided that she was going to vote for Donald Trump, which I felt was insane as a young African-American woman with children, that she would vote for Donald Trump. And she said things like you hear, if you watch any videos of Trump supporters, she was like, well, I said the things that he said, and he's like, well, I don't speak very well either in public. And, so in a certain way, yes, we have to get more people to vote, but I think we have to be real careful about that. you don't know what people are thinking. That was kind of a wake up call for me. Like, yeah.
Thanks, Angela. We saw that Sharon Ann would like to say something, and because she hasn't spoken yet, with your permission, we'll go to her first and then to Brandon.
Thank you. On a lighter side, may I ask that later on this evening, please do send your good wishful thoughts my way. This my birthday, a day that has until now come a little too often.
Happy birthday, Sharon Ann, even as we speak. And Brandon, you get the last word before we go to our closing slide.
Yeah. Okay. Question one of the other issues facing is the student and parent loan debt. The Biden administration is very adamant that they do not want the money, they don't want the debt relief to go to wealthy Americans. So I'm wondering if a way forward would be to say, okay, let's limit the student and parent loan, which affects Americans abroad. My wife's responsible for these parent loan of my stepson, quite a bit of money, and she's retired, so it does affect us. I wonder if a way forward could be to limit the debt relief to those to low middle class Americans, and put that forward as a way to break the impasse on the issue and get some debt relief.
Whoa, Brandon, you must have been listening in on our planning discussions for this meeting, because you took us right to our next event in the Progressive Caucus.
And Sue, could you present this one?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So we're getting close to our time to finish up. So we wanted to share some upcoming events. So the very next one is tomorrow, the launch of the DA's Environment and Climate Crisis Council. So I think Angela already put a link to that event in the chat and can put one in again. And in the Progressive Caucus, together with the Youth Caucus and quite a few country committees also co-sponsoring, we have an event tomorrow. Not tomorrow, next week on January 31st called Scared to Debt. And it includes free access to a film screening anytime you can attend it between January 27th and January 31st. And the film is all about student debt in the US, and it is a corrupt scam. There's some horrible stuff going on that we don't know about, most of us. Really outrageous things, taking horrible advantage of vulnerable people. And so that event is on January 31st, and we're going to have a panel discussion, including the filmmaker and other experts. And then we have our regular Progressive Caucus monthly Mondays meeting for your progressive minds on February 28th, and our regular monthly meeting just for members discussion and planning February 5th.
Sue, thank you very much for attracting our attention to those events. If we are going to get something done, then we have to get to work. And we have to do it by ourselves. We also have to do it all together. And with that, I want to encourage all of us to look for ways to join meetings like this again and participate in actions for the unfinished business that lies ahead of us. We can get it done, but we have to work hard and we have to work together. All right, I'm going to say goodbye for today and hope to see you at the DAECCC event tomorrow at our monthly members meeting on February 5th, and going ahead as we take care of unfinished business.
Bruce, can you just stop the recording and keep the meeting going just for a minute?
I certainly can do that.